Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our first OPSC of 2026. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I am one of the co-organizers of this series, along with Andres Gannon, who is the other co-organizer. And we are part of the Online Peace Science Colloquium, which was begun in 2015. This was started as an attempt to sort of extend the conversations that we were having at the Peace Science Society in the regular international meeting, and to ensure that we could learn from excellent scholars throughout the year, and that especially junior scholars and others could receive feedback as we present things online. So you can find us via the Standard Peace Science website. I believe we still have a presence on X as well, but mostly if you need to find us, we can have our previous recordings are all on YouTube, and you can look us up there. So today, we are going to have a fantastic paper titled Informal Cessation, Rethinking How Civil Wars End. This is brought to us by Wendy Wagner, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. She is also on the job market, so I want to give her a big shout out for all of the work that she is doing. And then we have two fantastic discussants. We are extremely grateful to them for volunteering. We have Reyko Huang and we have Michael Rubin. And so they're going to be giving Wendy their really great comments after the presentation. So just as a reminder to those in the audience, we would love for you to leave comments, questions in the chat. That would be fantastic. I will try to monitor those and try to see where they fit best in the discussant comments. We, of course, will have our discussants give 5 minutes of comments each, following at minimum. If we have a little bit more time, we'll dig back into those. But I will be saving the comments in the chat. All right. So Wendy is going to give us about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll be open for our discussants. So I'm going to be quiet, and I'll let Wendy go ahead and share her screen.
Thank you so much. This is great. Can you all see that right now? Should be in presentation mode already. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for being here, and also to Reyko and Michael for giving more in-depth comments to this paper. This is also my job market paper at the moment, and I hope to submit it sometime soon. Hope to generate kind of like another more round of comments, and then another round of edits, and hopefully be ready to submit it soon. So this paper focuses on a category of civil war termination that we don't usually think of as a category at all. Usually we think of something here that is called in UCDP data fading out. It's just wars that drop below the 25 annual battle death threshold. And because they drop, they are then considered as terminated conflict episodes. The question, though, is whether these are just kind of short-lived lulls in fighting. Is that kind of an ongoing civil war where just the battle death happened to drop for some time? And therefore, we kind of consider that as a termination. Or is there actually something else going on here where the belligerents cease fighting without a formal deal in some capacity? And is that an outcome in itself? And it's actually that most civil wars don't end with kind of these canonical outcomes, which is decisive victory or formal peace settlements. Those are actually kind of the rarer outcomes in the data. And most conflicts kind of fit in this fading out category. So I tried to think about an informal category of civil war termination, and I hope that I was able to kind of locate that within the more canonical outcomes. So usually, traditionally, we think of the formal column here in this table, decisive victory or peace agreement, which are defined by either just one actor persisting and the other being eliminated or demobilized, or both actors persist and kind of enter an agreement and sign a peace deal. But on the informal side, we can also have that type of situation. We can have that regardless of whether there was a decisive victory, we can see civil wars in which one side ultimately ceases to exist, maybe for reasons outside of the conflict diet. It could be something like the group collapses, or the group gets defeated in conflict with other non-state actors or something like that, where ultimately the group is eliminated, but not due to this civil conflict. And then we have this other category of informal cessation, where both actors do persist. They both continue to coexist within the formal territory of the state, and the armed group remains autonomous, remains armed, but we don't see any kind of agreement that would support that relationship or formalize that relationship. So I coded out these cases from essentially from the cases that were coded as faded out in the UCDP data. And the cases that kind of conform to this definition are shown here in the middle, and they are by vast amounts the majority of outcomes that exist. So here you see again decisive victories over time, peace agreement frequency over time, and informal outcomes are kind of the majority that we see. So this motivates me to ask under what conditions essentially opponents in a civil conflict cease fighting informally without a decisive outcome, any kind of decisive battle, or a codified settlement. And that's the motivation for this paper and this talk today. I hope that I can, by introducing this informal category, expand our understanding of civil war termination. It's not to compete with other outcomes, but just to say that the framework should encapsulate these informal cessations as well. I provide new data on this particular outcome for future study as well. And I hope that I can offer a theoretical framework that shows us why informality in civil conflicts can be strategic, and also highlighting the conditions under which these types of informal outcomes and bargains are specifically viable, not under all conditions, right? So let me just take a step back and talk about civil war resolution, civil war termination for a second before I go really into the argument. So usually we know that it is very difficult to resolve civil conflicts. It is difficult to reach a peace settlement, right? It's riddled with commitment problems and enforcement problems. Specifically, rebels fear backlash if they have to disarm. They fear that the government might renege, specifically under weak and authoritarian institutions, where the government has a strong incentive to renege on a deal after the rebels have demobilized. But states also fear public concessions. They have reputational concerns. And overall, states want to maybe avoid locking in certain formal or more permanent institutional reforms, right? So these peace agreements are difficult because they would lock in kind of these concessions that states might want to reverse if possible later. And traditionally, we overcome some of these problems by thinking about agreement design, building in checks and balances, or relying on third-party enforcement and external actors that help solve some of these commitment and enforcement problems. Of course, when the outcome is informal, we don't have agreement design or usually third-party enforcement available to kind of help resolve this conflict. But we have something else. In informal cessations, we don't have disarmament. We essentially avoid on the rebel side the risks associated with disarmament, and rebels retain coercive capacity to punish defection from the deal themselves, right? So the deal is more directly enforced rather than enforced by an external actor as rebels demobilize. And informality offers another benefit to the state. They avoid costly, public, more visible concessions. Essentially, the concessions are de facto concessions, and they don't need to make permanent institutional reforms to accommodate the rebels. If this would be so easy, we could say, okay, why don't we always do these informal deals? Rebels can enforce them, states avoid all these pitfalls. But of course, the same capacity that helps these deals be more viable creates a dilemma for the state. Because the same capacity that can be used to enforce the deals is also the capacity that can be used for future violence. Who's to say that now the rebels won't renege in the next period and turn back against the state? So there's some risk involved here for the state. So this toleration dilemma creates conditions under which states would not allow every rebel group of any strength or any form to just persist in their country, right? It also creates conditions where not every rebel is going to be satisfied with these de facto informal concessions. So really to answer when informal cessation is most likely is kind of a question of certain Goldilocks conditions. Under what conditions are rebels willing to accept these informal concessions, informal cessation? And under what conditions are states willing to tolerate an armed group that continues to exist and hold control within their territory? So essentially, these two things have to meet, essentially creating some sort of equilibrium conditions under which informal cessation is most likely. So I propose that states essentially minimize the risks associated with this toleration, essentially the risk of future conflict, and the cost of concessions by selectively tolerating only weaker rebels and those that make more bounded territorial demands. I will explain both sides in a second. Under these conditions, it's the states that can tolerate the risks more easily, but also those are the rebels that are likely to be more satisfied and accepting of smaller informal concessions. So on the side of lower capacity, of rebel weakness, you can think about, the relationship between capacity and deals, the size of deals you're likely to expect. If rebels are weaker, they realistically expect fewer concessions, which means they are, for the state, cheaper to buy off. They are also more likely to accept informal outcomes compared to stronger rebels who might push for either victory or push for a formal settlement in which the state has to make these commitments public and formal to the group. Non-disarmament means for the rebels that they retain this ability for enforcement, even if they are weaker than the state. They still have kind of the ability to sting, but they cannot be too strong for the state to tolerate them to threaten regime survival, right? So it's retaining capacity, but the state would not allow this in the case of the stronger rebel groups. And on the side of the bounded demands side, the logic kind of plays out like this, that bounded demands, so clearly defined demands, have been shown to make commitments more credible, as rebels, for example, only demand a certain peripheral ethnic territory, and their claims to this territory are very clearly defined. They don't have aspiration to take the entire country, right? They only want this particular enclave in the country. That would be a very clearly defined bounded demand. It's also, I argue, more likely that territorial demands are satisfied already by de facto control. So rebels that might desire autonomy or even independence in some cases might be satisfied. Actually, their outcome goal might already be achievable if they achieve de facto control of this territory, right? The formal aspect is nice for rebels, but it's more important that they have essentially de facto outcome goal achievement, which for territorial rebels can be established by just controlling the territory. This is different from other types of goals that rebels might pursue. So regime change goals or even political rights goals, they are much harder to achieve on a de facto level, right? So if you want rights for your ethnic group or you want regime change overall, it's something that the state cannot give you usually in an informal manner. They have to make a formal agreement. They have to be institutional changes that go along with that. This is much more difficult to achieve without a treaty. Territory can also be differently valued. So the territory that is highly valuable to the group might not be so valuable to the state, depending on things like the ethnic composition of this territory or the resource wealth of the territory, right? A resource-rich region would be more difficult for the state to concede, whereas a resource scarce and highly ethnic region that aligns with the rebels would be easier to concede. There's also an element here that a lot of these territories can be peripheral, so they can be far away from the seat of the state, which means controlling this territory is less threatening to the state at its seat of power. And the ethnic division also helps the rebels and the state to establish defensible separation. So if the territories are clearly separated and ethnic groups that are in conflict can be clearly separated by this territorial division, it is shown that that is more likely to end conflicts and also end them more lastingly if this can be established. So this leads me to really two expectation that informal cessation is more likely in civil wars involving weaker rebel groups rather than stronger ones, and also that informal cessation is more likely in civil wars involving these types of bounded territorial demands, especially along some dimensions like ethnicity, distance to the capital, and resource wealth. So I'm going to test that with a simple kind of two-step design. I won't bore you with the estimation formulas here, but just to give you the basic overview. I have found 223 informal cessations out of 609 overall terminations. So that could end in victory, formal agreement, and informal cessation over the course from 1960 to 2020. I'm first using a logistic regression to estimate the probability of informal cessation compared to other outcomes. So what makes a conflict more likely to end in informal cessation rather than victory or formal settlement, kind of comparing these outcomes. And then also a multinomial regression in which each outcome is compared to ongoing conflict as the reference category. So what kind of determinants make it more likely that victory occurs versus conflict going on, which determinants make it more likely that formal agreement will occur rather than conflict going on, and so on. So I use a set of relative strength measures, both the total force estimate as well as categorical and binary measures of rebel strength. I use a variable to crystallize out the type of rebel demands coming from Forge. And I use some measures about the territory that the rebels are claiming, distance to the capital, the ethnic composition, resources, alongside some of the more standard controls like battle death, intensity, things like that. And here are some of my results. So these are results from a range of logistic regression models with varying controls. I want to just direct your attention to the right-hand side of this figure here. So in the top, we have whether rebels were weaker than the state as a binary measure. And then we have different type of strength estimates that are if rebels get stronger, essentially, so the reverse of that, we would expect here negative coefficients. If rebels get stronger, they are less likely to end in informal cessation. If rebels are weaker, that is the group that informal cessation becomes more likely. And then here in the bottom, we have whether the conflict was territorial overall. We find positive significant results here. And especially if we interact the rebel demands being territorial rather than rights-based or regime change-based, then we find that those rebels with territorial demands are the ones more likely to enter these informal cessations. So we see much weaker rebels, and those in territorial conflict are most likely. Here we see the results of this multinomial regression I was talking about. So each column represents one of the outcome types. We have government victory, rebel victory, formal peace agreement, and informal cessation. And in each case, the reference category is ongoing conflict, right? So here, for example, in the informal cessation column. Generally, this table really generally shows that conflicts are hard to resolve in any kind of capacity, right? In any kind of capacity, um, things usually make resolution difficult. So we see, for example, weaker rebels are also here to some degree more likely than very, very weak rebels to get a peace settlement. Groups that are at par with the government are very unlikely to get a peace settlement. They are more likely, however, to win. Stronger rebels, win more often. And generally, this also shows that overall, if we consider uh, um, whether a conflict is resolved in any of these capacities, territorial conflicts are the ones that overall are very difficult to resolve, right? So they usually last longer than other types of conflict. I want to bring in this kind of these characteristics of the territory that we're talking about. Here are a number of interaction models, each considering a different aspect or characteristic of the territory. So in the first column, we see the interaction between rebel territorial demands and distance to the capital of the country. And despite this very small coefficient, it's actually indicating an increase in the probability of informal cessation as we move 1 kilometer away from the capital. So the further away from the capital the ethnic territory lies, the more likely informal cessation is. The easier it is for the state to tolerate rebel control there, the further away from the seat of power. At the same time, we have this interaction of ethnic composition of the territory. If there's a high geographic concentration of the ethnic group in this territory that the rebels claim, and they are having these territorial goals, we have a much increased likelihood of informal cessation. But on the flip side, if we are having territorial demands where the ethnic composition is not concentrated, a very diverse ethnic composition, both ethnic groups that are constituents of the government, the regime, and members of the constituency of the rebel group live there together. So not ethnic separation, essentially. We have a much lower likelihood of informal cessation, right? So it's the highly ethnic territory that experiences these informal cessation. And I do not find strong results that the presence of oil fields, for example, matters a lot for this. All right, you might be wondering whether again these are just short-lived pauses. Is it just that these territorial conflicts with Greek rebels need to pause more often? And therefore, we see these informal cessations appear in the data, and it's just kind of that, weak rebels need to recuperate more, and territorial conflicts are so hard to resolve that, you'll just find some pauses sometimes. So I imposed different durability thresholds to assess that. What if we say the informal cessation just has to last 1 year? What if we restrict that to 5 years or even 10 years? And we find that these results persist, right? So even if I restrict the sample and say, I'm only interested in what drives informal cessations that lead to at least 5 years of peace or at least 10 years of peace, I see the results persist. So it is not just that these results are driven by these short-lived lulls in fighting, but actually also drive longer-term cessations. Okay, so just to summarize and conclude here, I hope that I can argue that informal cessation is a meaningful outcome, a meaningful form of conflict termination that is worth considering, and it's not just the absence of peace or the absence of a resolution. I've shown that weaker rebels and those with bounded territorial demands are more likely to experience cessation, specifically in majority ethnic and peripheral territories. And they are not just mere lulls. The we have to think of them as kind of a strategic, meaningful outcome category. And I think it can also lead us to rethink the intractability of territorial and ethnic conflict. Usually, civil conflict literature shows that territorial conflicts are really difficult to resolve overall, very unlikely to reach peace settlements, but they may not be unlikely to end. They may be difficult to reach a formal peace settlement, but there may be kind of a way out here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Wendy, for that excellent presentation. So we're going to go ahead and go straight into our discussant comments. So Reyko, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you go ahead and go first. And Wendy, you can stop screen sharing whenever you feel comfortable.
All right, thank you. Wendy, I really enjoy this paper. It's a really terrific paper. It's incredibly strong. I wish that it were already under review. I think it needs to be out. There is just so much to like about this paper. It is just, it's ambitious in its scale. You're addressing this large literature on war termination. You're addressing, the multiple rounds of empirical analysis based on sort of a prototype prototype treatment of war outcomes. You're engaging in the whole institutionalist credible commitment literature, and weaving that into your original theory. And so, it's really important. It's ambitious, and it also delivers. It's a really strong paper, both theoretically and empirically, and I think that you need to get it out soon. I really was hooked with the framing. It's very compelling. It's a great research question. I like how you, say the one category that everybody has treated as a residual so far. And I think that's absolutely correct. It's always been this black box of, the conflicts that kind of fade out and peter out. We're not interested in that. We're just interested in the decisive victories and, of course, the peace agreements. And you take, what is like a treatment that is entirely devoid of agency, right? These conflicts, they just kind of peter out. And we don't know what to do with them, so they're the residual. And you give all the agency in introducing this new theory of why these informal cessations occur. And it turns out they don't just occur. As you well demonstrate, they're the most common type of war termination since 1960. And so, right off the bat, your descriptive analysis is so important. And then that just hooks you into the question of, well, why is this the case? And so really excellent setup, an important question. The paper is also very clearly written. It's engaging. You walk us through your original theory and then the empirical analysis very, very clearly. So that I appreciated as well. And I think anyone writing, conducting a study on war termination going forward will ignore this residual category that is not at all a residual, as you argue, that is actually the predominant type of war termination at their own peril. That's a big study, and I think that is going to have a lot of impact. Just to warn you, I think it's going to be more praises than any form of criticism in my comments to you. So the theory, again, is original. It's compelling. I think at its core, it makes a distinction between the formality of settlements and the credibility of settlements. And whereas previous literature has said we need formality, right? And this is the institutionalist literature. We need these pieces of paper. We need formal agreements. We need them signed for these settlements to be credible. And you make an intervention saying, actually, there are ways in which actors see that the very informality of termination is itself the credible commitment. And you walk us through how that works. And I think that's original and really insightful and important. And so formality versus credibility. I don't know that you quite put it this way, but I think to me, that is the key takeaway here, that non-formal agreements, or actually not at all agreements, that informal endings can be just as credible because of their very the very nature, the very dynamics of them, and that in fact they are self-enforcing under certain circumstances. And that's a very bold claim amidst this very large literature that say that the formality is the key to overcoming these commitment problems. And of course, as you read through the paper, the argument is so compelling that you begin to wonder why anyone enters into any formal contracts at all, right? And you point out that these are flexible, they're reversible. I was thinking of like James Scott, who says, make sure you design institutions in a way that they're reversible because there are, humans make errors all the time or the circumstances change. And I don't think you reference him, but, there's the reversibility, there's the informality, there's the flexibility. And under certain conditions, they just work well for both parties, right? And then, of course, you introduce the toleration dilemma that, precisely explains why we don't see it in every situation, and when in fact, formality is the preferred or the better way to go in other circumstances. So. I think every time I had a question, you pretty much addressed it at some point in the paper. There is one part of the paper though, and I would say that my comments here are pretty minor. I don't think that these are like deal breakers. I think that you should, get this out sooner than later. One question that I did have is on state capacity, and so. As I'm reading the paper, it makes sense to me that Uyghur rebels are more likely to, opt for these informal cessations, and that does raise the question of what about state capacity, right? And there's all this literature, and it might benefit you to reference, scholars like Jeffrey Herbst's early work on African state development. Hillel Soifer has written on infrastructural power. Right. So there are these canonical studies saying states really, they don't give up territory easily. In fact, even these very far-flung places populated by a different ethnic or cultural linguistic group are very meaningful to them, and therefore we don't see border changes all the time at all. Right? These are very infrequent phenomena. And they really want to hang on to even very remote territories. And that weaker states in particular have a very hard time developing this infrastructural capacity to reach into the peripheries. And so what about state capacity, right? And you do address this at the very end of the paper more empirically than theoretically, I think. And you find that there is no strong correlation there with informal cessations, but that kind of just left me wondering. So I would love to see that being addressed a little bit more. Is it that empirically all of the states involved here, right, the states in question are just invariably weak, and therefore there's not a whole lot of variation there? I think this is where some cases could also illuminate why state capacity is not an important dynamic in this story. Yeah, so yeah, I will leave it at that. I think so this is not really addressed in theoretically. Empirically, you do look at this. I think part of the confusion is the measurement of state of weaker rebels, which is a relative. The main measure is relative, and so it's very, very difficult to interpret that. I know you have other measures of rebel capacity and rebel weakness that are not relative. But how do we interpret that with, on the state side? And is there a way, I think you use the usual measurements of state capacity, but is there a way to actually, perhaps better include this in your empirical analysis? And then there are, I think, two other bodies of work that this study speaks really nicely to and that are not referenced here. And these are just, I offer these as suggestions to just tap into all of the different kinds of works that your study speaks to in really important ways. One is the argument put forth primarily by Tanisha Fazal about why state actors don't declare war anymore. And she has this really important argument based on normative changes in the international system. And at least at the interstate level, she argues that given this new normative context post 1945 and the emergence of a consensus around the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, states just don't want to be formal anymore, and that it is in their best interest to keep war more or less informal so that they don't have to be explicitly bound to these international treaties. Yours is not at all a normative argument. And in fact, you argue that this doesn't have a temporal dimension, that this is empirically, you find this to be, your argument to hold across at least your temporal demarcation, which is the Cold War versus the post-Cold War. But I wondered about this also. Is there any aspect of a temporal issue here? You might also look at the work of Lise Howard and Alexandra Stark on how wars end, and they also make a temporal and normative argument that victories used to be the most common form, then the rise of peace agreements because there was an international normative interest in seeing peace agreements and peacekeepers being deployed to enforce the peace, and then they sort of hint at the end of the article that might also be changing post the war on terrorism, and that victories might be now on the rise. And so I think there are various scholars raising the issue of a normative context in which war terminations occur. And so you might look into that literature a little more and really not just empirically examine that, but theorize that as well, and why you think that it is sufficiently compelling to just focus on the domestic dynamics and local dynamics of war settlement, and more or less bracket off the external dimension. And finally, I think your work speaks really nicely to the literature on frozen conflicts. I think there is not, a lot of theorizing there, but this is an empirical fact that frozen conflicts exist. And we have all these de facto states in far-flung, areas of various states like Somaliland and Abkhazia and Transnistria and others. And they're a feature of our international system. And I think that literature is easily incorporated into your study to say, the study can actually explain these contexts as well. And then I think, this is one final comment. This is probably well beyond the scope of your paper, but I did wonder, and if you ever have an intention of turning this into a book manuscript, I think this is where, questions like this could come in, hopefully with some in-depth case studies and case illustrations. I wondered whether there could be a relational dynamic here, in the sense that state and rebel leaders often know each other. They're doing a lot of backdoor diplomacy, whereas on the battlefield, their adversaries, behind the scenes, they're talking, and whether that dynamic plays into what to us looks like informal agreements or informal settlements, but behind the scenes might have been an explicit agreement to just lay down arms and create a new status quo. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks, Reyko. All right, we'll move on to Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just, in the interest of time, I'll just echo like all of the praise that Reyko nicely laid out in the beginning. Like this is a really important paper research question, and it's going to make a big contribution. And I'll add one other layer that might be helpful for framing, especially if you want to pitch it to like like an IO or a major international relations journal. Is like I think this is especially important at this moment in time, per some of the things that Reyko covered, which is that we're all concerned about, the collapse of international institutions and peacemaking and mediation, and like norms of solving conflict and conflict management, and like can any of these international institutions do this anymore, or are they failing? So a lot of those debates about like the ways to formally resolve conflicts and like how do we move the needle on these institutional frameworks may become not less relevant because those are also important, but it'll be especially important to point to the informality approaches, like the informal approaches that you're highlighting. So that could be one additional framing thing. The other point about like one of the big contributions that I'll mention is like, of course, this is one of the things that stuck out to me, of course, is this data collection on separating. You do a really nice job conceptually with separating the informal cessation from these petering out inactivity categories. And I think it was sort of like more mentioned almost in passing in the first parts of the paper. And then you get into it in the empirical section, but that's like however many pages deep. And I think that could be really pitched as like, this is a major contribution, is not just this theoretical innovation and this conceptual innovation, but here's, data to help you solve these problems that of why this category may have been ignored in the past. So I think that's a really important empirical contribution, even just the data that could be made clear right up front. Okay, so like again, this is a paper that's ready to go out very soon. So a lot of my comments are, okay, how do we maybe sharpen some of these things, or maybe help you elevate, like this will be competitive at the most competitive journals, right? One theoretical point that I was that I that came to me was there's a sort of strong assumption about and this is reasonable. Our theories are simplifications, but this was something they need to push on or think about, engage in, even if you don't like complicate the theory more. Is there's a strong assumption that like part of the commitment problem is based on this assumption of like disarmament is needed for the formal outcomes. And I was wondering about like the gray areas, right? Like, aren't there solutions that armed warring parties have at least tried to come up with, and maybe have implemented in certain cases? I was thinking about um, the negotiations in like the Bangsa Moro conflict in the Philippines, where they kind of like folded the MILF, MNLF into local security institutions. So they're like formalized ways to have them keep their arms that are not completely informal, but are also like controlling in some fashion. Like, how does the relaxation of that assumption affect some of the theoretical empirical implications? Um, that was one thing that came to mind. Um, I thought that one thing to consider is the theory is so clear and strong uh, i- and parsimonious that I have reservations in recommending this. But like one thing that I was wondering is, you know, I think it's very strong and clear about how we get to informal cessation, like as opposed to peaceful settlement. But I was wondering if there would be, like, more attention or discussion could be made about like, okay, how do we get to in how does the factors that lead us to informal cessation lead us to informal settlement over not just peaceful settlement, but like also victory and also the fading out category? Because one thing I was thinking about is like, especially for rebel strength is, if the rebels are weaker, you would also think that the costs of continued fighting are lower, and the probability of government victory is higher, right? So how do we like incorporate those substitution and multiple like independence of the alternatives sort of that lead to the multinomial logit analysis that you're talking about, but it's not it like the hypotheses are very much framed in the binary outcome, informal secession or not. And so there isn't as much of a theoretical and hypothesis generating sort of foundation for the multinomial logit, which, speaks to some of these things. So you might develop that a little bit. Um, and sort of just an add-on to that is um, I was wondering about, with the government victory especially idea or continued fighting, um, is this rebel weakness really not, I mean, monotonic. Because even in the presentation, you talked about this like Goldilocks idea. But that's not, I don't think, as strong in the paper. So, is there like a non-monotonic relationship, especially when you consider not just the informal or not, but like the different categories, how you would sort, into? On the sort of like state capacity and other literatures that would be helpful here, I think there's like some additional sort of cognate outcomes that speak to this informal cessation that I suggest not just, because like, oh, you must cite everything or whatever, but because you might have a productive conversation with the explanations for these sort of cognate concepts that sort of sharpen this and highlight your contribution, especially since one of them is a recent book. I was thinking about Paul Stanoland's book, Ordering Violence, where he talked about these armed orders, which include like surprising, limited cooperation or business partnerships, he calls them, where the government and the rebel groups actually like form these essentially informal agreements um, to live and let live, essentially. Um, and he highlights, like the state's ideological project and these political factors and how they interact with rebel ideology and factors. So there's a nice, I mean, I think he also talks about some of the things that you were talking about, but there would be a nice sort of contribution there of like, yes, as Stanoland notes, there's political and ideological components to this, but I'm demonstrating, these other factors and how they matter. There's also a recent book by David Uko. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but it's called The Insurgent's Dilemma. And he has this concept of localized insurgency, which is engaging with some of the components that Reyko raised about state capacity or the state's interest. He actually has this other argument, which is that like in a lot of these peripheral areas, the state doesn't really care so much to pursue. And so that's when you get these sort of localized insurgencies where the state just allows them to, de facto do their thing. And that's, a trend in the post-Cold War period of how insurgencies are sort of like petering out or remaining, but not rising to these levels. So engaging with some of his arguments and making um, uh, uh, sharpening the contribution. There's also like the ceasefires literature that you engage with a little bit. But I was thinking about Colby Hanson's work on these long-term, how do we get to these long-term ceasefires that are essentially like a version of this informal cessation. They just like, okay, we'll just like have a ceasefire and we'll be this steady state. And he has some ideas that intersect with some of your predictors that you highlight, but having that productive conversation would be useful. Um, Really quickly, empirically, one thing that I might just flag, I don't know what the best, anyways, like there's issues raised in some of this literature about like the dyadic framework, level of aggregation, because it sort of speaks to some of the issues that you raise in the paper about like what do you do with these categories where like the group, splinters um, or merges or whatever, and other sort of forms of like weird configuration changes in the Civil War, and like Sam Banas and others have this concept of like, well, we shouldn't do this in dyadic framework because of it's a conflict level phenomenon, and there's all these inferential issues or estimation issues with the dyadic framework. In the way the dyadic framework makes sense because it's this bargaining idea. So like I don't think you necessarily like throw out the dyadic or anything, but like just engaging with some of those critiques might be helpful. Um, and I don't know if I missed this, but I was wondering one of the main empirical things that I would push for is like I sometimes lost the thread of like where are the fading out categories now, right? Like the fading out category wasn't one of the potential outcomes in the multinomial logit, and I wasn't always sure in the descriptives of like what percentage of the fading out categories did you code actively as informal secession and what's the rump category? Because I think it's still there. It's not like the informal secession dummy or whatever is the same as the inactivity dummy. So like having that either be a category or like showing descriptively what the case, and even through a case illustration, or just an example. Here are the kinds of cases that were coded as informal secession, and here are the kinds of cases that remained, petering out or whatever. And a more discussion about like what are the observables that were used to sort of make that distinction? Because I imagine this was a ton of work because it's such a gray area in a lot of cases. So, making those observable indicators clear, I think would help. I have other things, but I'll also send you my notes. So,
All right, awesome. Thank you, Michael. So Wendy, in the interest of time, I'm going to give you just a moment or two if you want to either ask for any clarifications or just respond to anything that Reyko and Michael have raised. We do have a comment in the chat, so I want to make sure that we get to that too. So go ahead and take just a second to do that.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate your comments. First of all, they make me feel very good and confident in the paper, which we always doubt our own work along the way, right? But I appreciate any comments about the framing and adding to other literatures and just like emphasizing the contribution of this paper more. It's funny that Reyko mentioned kind of the formality versus credibility distinction because I'm writing a part of my dissertation on the durability of these situations where that's exactly the argument, that it's not formality that makes them durable, but essentially these equilibrium conditions. So I'm going to bring that into this paper as well, I think, and emphasize that a bit more. And I really love the state capacity side of it. And Michael, you just mentioned that there's actually contradictory arguments there, right? Whether the state doesn't want to give up territory or really doesn't care about these peripheral regions, right? So I think I can add to that conversation really nicely. So I appreciate that. And please send me the comments. I'm sure I couldn't write down everything you said, so appreciate it.
Just a quick reminder that you will be able to go back and rewatch this as needed as well, Wendy. So, yeah. All right. So, Mason has dropped us a comment in the chat. I mean, obviously praising your work, first of all. So that's fantastic. So given that your theory draws a lot from formal theories of war termination, do you think incorporating informal cessation and credibility would change these formal models' theoretical expectations for war termination? Particularly since the models only assume that players win or lose. Is there a way that allowing rebels to keep their guns changes how we view credibility in these models? Or should we think of informal cessation as a type of settlement within the bounds of these models? So Wendy, you are welcome to engage with that or save it for later. I think it's a fantastic set of questions.
This is such a fun question. So I think I do the latter. I think my argument is that if we actually take these formal models of bargaining and we look at them, there's nothing in the models themselves that says that the outcome needs to be formal in any way, right? So classic bargaining model of war, we can divide this range, this territory, or whatever, this divisible area, and we divide it a certain way because of power distribution, and then we just walk away, right? There's nothing there that says that that has to be formal in any way, as long as it's credible and enforceable. And I think that's exactly the point that I'm making, that in Civil War literature, we have somehow made that assumption that it is the formal deals that help us overcome that. And that is the case, right? We can design peace agreements to be in ways that overcome these commitment problems and inhibit settlements, but settlements themselves don't have that, like the formality is not a necessary condition for it to last, right? I guess that's how I would put it. That's exactly how I try to engage that formal literature. And I think there's some work in the bargaining literature, kind of Schultz and Gurman's recent stuff on these bounded demands that I'm like using in this paper that say exactly that, right? So for example, if you just clearly know the rebels only want this little piece, it's way easier, it's way more credible that they won't fight you later again, right? Because now you know that's what they want. It's interesting because bargaining literature also had assumed that territory is somehow indivisible. To me, that's kind of not so intuitively clear because territory seems to be the most divisible thing almost in practice, right? We can divide it any which way. So I think this bounded demands element shows that really nicely that if you really only have a claim to a small area, it can make these bargains actually more credible just by itself, right? Without actually including enforcement in the model or anything like that. Just if the other actor knows you only want a small piece, it's already way more credible that way. So yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mason, and thank you, Wendy, for the answer to those great questions. So I'll just we have a few more moments, not many. So if anyone has any last comments that they'd like to, either Wendy, if you have anything you want to address, or either of our two discussants, if there's anything that you set aside initially, please feel free to dig on in.
I guess I can just ask Reyko and Michael again about the state capacity thing. So, as I said, there's like two arguments, I guess, there. Is it fair do you think it would expand the theory too much to try to theorize that as part of the theory? Because I don't want to, increase that a lot. Or is there a way to comment on that literature and then bracket it essentially from a strategic point? Is that how you would think of it? I can see it either way, but
the theory is so nicely done and it's so very parsimonious. I hesitate to expand it.
Okay.
At the same time, it was a theoretical question that I was having throughout the text.
Okay.
So, I think one way to do this is to, when you get to the state capacity section, I think you basically just present the finding and say, see, it's not there. But that might be where you can then sort of engage briefly with a theory and why you think that can be bracketed off.
There might be a middling approach where it's like folded in with respect to the rebel weakness, right? Like, how one version is to like take those as two separate dimensions, and one is to think about like focusing on like the state capacity side. One thing that came to mind was that I forgot about this. Like I was encountering, I think there's been a lot of innovations in like subnational level state capacity data sets that are not just from a particular context, but like designed to be cross-national, like comparative, consistent and comparable across contexts. I'll dig around and try and find them, but like I think that's something that could be like to Reyko's point about like not the sync scores or not GDP, but like these measures of like the state's local capacity could really help because you could like calculate those distances between like whatever something of the state like has this level of capacity. And one way to resolve this theoretical and empirical dimension might be to engage with like the areas of limited statehood literature. Like they have thought about this kind of issue a lot. That could help you sort of thread that needle and frame the like, there are these two competing sort of set of expectations on that and how it would influence the expectations.
Awesome.
Okay, well, this is perfect. We are
Yeah.
pretty much right at time. So I will go ahead and thank each of you again. Thank you, audience, for attending and for the great comments. Wendy, thank you for a fantastic paper. It seems like the consensus is that you need to get this out so that everyone beyond this conversation can read it. Reyko and Michael, thank you for really constructive, useful discussant feedback. We certainly appreciate that. So I'll just remind everyone that you can find this recording on YouTube again. So Wendy, if you want to go back and look at comments, these will be available to you. And then you may also find that some people will comment on the YouTube itself. So again, thanks to each of you. This is what allows us to keep going. So everyone have a great Friday.